Our scripture reading this morning is taken from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 to 8. This portion can be found in page 213 of the New Testament portion of your Pew Bible. Readings from the 2 Timothy chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. Hear what the Spirit say to the church. In the presence of God and Christ Jesus, who is to the judge of the living and the dead, and in the view of his appearing and his kingdom, I solemnly urge you, proclaim the message. Be persistent in whether the time is favorable or unfavorable. Convince, rebuke, and encourage with the utmost patience in teaching. For the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but have itching ears. They will accumulate themselves teachers to set their own desires, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wandering away to myths. As for you, you will always be sober, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, carry out your ministry fully. As for me, I'm already being poured out of a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, not only to me, but to all who have longed for his appearance. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you so much. Partway through my first semester of Econ 1000, our prof started the class by asking a broad, wide-open question and asked if any one of us first-year undergrads could name a Nobel Prize winner in the field of economics. The class was noticeably silent. Fortunately, though, I had stayed up way too late the night before watching A Beautiful Mind, and instead of doing my Economics 1000 reading for that day. So I put up my hand way too confidently and answered, well, what about John Nash? The prof responded to me, said, that was math, but that's close enough. He assigned my roommate to take notes for me that day and called me to come sit with him in the front row. And in front of me was a massive box of chocolate donuts. Your job today, he informed me, your only job is to sit and listen to the lecture and eat as many of these donuts as you want to. Whenever you finish one, I want you to interrupt me and give it a score out of 10. Now, if you know me, you know I've been known to crush a donut or two in my day. So I felt like this was finally an economics assignment that was right up my alley. I finished the first donut and gave it a resounding 10 out of 10. Same with the second. By donut 3, though, I was starting to feel a sugar rush, and so I gave it an 8. By donut 5, I was starting to feel full. It got a 5. Well before the hour's lecture was up, I had tucked into 8 donuts. And the 8th got a resounding score of 0. I hobbled back to my dorm after class and collapsed into a sugar coma to be awakened by my roommate with a copy of that day's notes. His only question for me was it worth it? How do you answer that question when you're asked it? How do you assign value to the work you do? What keeps you from lying awake at night and second-guessing every decision that you've made to this point? From the outside of a life of faith, the answer to that question is actually relatively simple. To paraphrase the great economist Milton Friedman, a business's only ethical obligation is to its shareholders. If it's cheaper for a factory to pollute the water than it is to pay a fine to upgrade its filtration system, then guess what they're going to do? If something sells in the marketplace of ideas, that is its value. But from the inside, it's a different story. Paul's letter to his protege Timothy reads like a masterclass in how to understand the question my roommate posed to me. Was it worth it? Because Paul had been beaten, he'd been imprisoned, he'd been shipwrecked, he'd been poisoned, he'd been lonely and persecuted, betrayed and abandoned. And then along comes Timothy, faithful, energetic, optimistic, full of zeal for the church, and excited to tell everyone about Jesus. But Timothy is understandably hesitant. There are a lot of unanswered questions for him. This is, after all, a time of unprecedented upheaval for the church. Persecutions abound, and part of him wonders, no matter what he believes, is there even going to be a church to live into in the future? Is it any wonder why so many of us can identify with Timothy? But as Timothy and Paul correspond over the years, two pieces of their correspondence make it into our New Testament. In this morning's reading, we see the culmination of that question. Was it worth it? Well, says Paul, as an answer to that question, let me just say to you, I fought the good fight. I finished the race. I kept the faith. What a lifetime of wisdom has taught Paul is that the only way to tell if something has a real worth is how much of your life you're willing to give over to it. That in the economics of infinity, it is the breath in your lungs and the rhythm of your pulse that are the only real currency that matters. This is what the missionary Elisabeth Elliot meant when she said, "That person is no fool who gives up what they cannot keep to gain what they cannot lose." It's in the little things, in the everyday, mundane, ordinary decisions that we make in the run of a day that have an outsized impact on the shape of our life. Like how the smallest river, if given enough time, can carve a Grand Canyon. The steady flow of choices in front of us will make and remake us 1,000 times before we die. This is why the theologian Richard Rohr said, "We do not think ourselves into a new way of living. We live ourselves into a new way of thinking." And it's why Jesus was so passionate about things that seem so inconsequential. Why he would say things like, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. For it's better to be blind in the kingdom than to see yourself miss it. We are a product of the life we live. And we are every day determining not only our own worth, but the worth of everything and everyone we come into contact with. So Paul makes the choice to remind Timothy, to point to him what has always been the spiritual expression of our worshiping life. Not from ego or from vanity or from pride or from arrogance, but with humility and love, Paul reminds Timothy that he has given everything in his world to the work of serving Jesus. Nothing has been held back. Paul no longer sees himself as a living sacrifice, constantly needing to crawl back onto the altar. Now he is a drink offering, a pouring out of God's abundant life into the world. He has followed the way of Jesus with everything he had inside of him and everything he was and everything he would ever be. He has given over to the service of God's work in this world. And in doing so, he holds forth a word of life to us today. I have no idea if Paul had any sense of the power in this, but nearly 2,000 years later, theologians still hold up the conversion of Paul from a zealous persecutor of the church to its greatest champion as one of the single greatest pieces of evidence for Christianity's authenticity. Paul's willingness to decrease so that Christ could increase has shaped lives for millennia and will for the future to come. This is the indelible mercy of God's economy. When the things we value are the things that last, there are no bad investments. So Paul answers himself in sacrifice as the answer. Paul offers himself in sacrifice as the answer to Timothy's question, was it all worth it? In essence, what he's saying is, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Because that's the secret of Christian discipleship. There is no million-dollar idea. There is no book that you need to buy to figure out how to live a Christian life. Find someone you want to be like and do what they do. Practice what they practice. Go where they go. And then ask yourself the question, was it worth it? I fought the good fight, says Paul. I finished the race. I kept the faith. So with Timothy, Paul offers us a picture of what worthy living really looks like. See, wisdom says that everything has its season, that peace has a place and a time, but so does a fight. There is, in the words of Ecclesiastes, a time to kill, a time to make war. There are times and reasons for every course of action that we can undertake as human beings. And wisdom says that the decision about which is settled squarely in the souls of men and women. Like Tim said to us a few weeks ago, the line between good and evil runs down the middle of every human heart. But tomorrow, November the 11th, is a solemn, secular reminder that there are things in this life that are worth fighting for. There are things in this life worth dying for. You were worth fighting for. You were worth dying for. And in assigning that worth, the 100 million plus people who died in the wars of the 20th century, knowingly or unknowingly followed in the footsteps of their Maker, who told us that the greatest expression of love a person can make is to lay down their life for someone else. Christ fought for you and fights for you still. For you, Christ came. For you, Christ lived. For you, Christ died. For you, Christ rose. And for you, Christ will come again. And if love is worth dying for, surely to God it must be worth fighting for. If you've been around church for any length of time, though, you've seen how the church tends to fight. Poorly. In the town where I began my ministry, a town of 900 people, there were 10 churches. 2 of them Pentecostal churches, because at some point in their history, one group of Pentecostals had decided that the other group of Pentecostals were not simply Pentecostal enough. Maybe you've been around church enough to have been part of those fights, and you understand why the church has a reputation of being the only group that shoots its wounded. The stories of ugly, bitter, divisive fights over property and petty theological quibbles are the ones that stand out to us. But badly is not the only tool that the church has to fight with. When Christian missionaries first arrived on the Korean Peninsula in the late 19th century, many of them from the Presbyterian Church in Canada, they found themselves in an occupied country. Japanese imperial guardsmen enforced a harsh regime on the Korean people. And the church was faced with a choice. Take the easy route and do what they've done 1,000 times before and rely on diplomatic ties for the church to gain a foothold in Japanese territory, or start with the local population and build the church under the heel of an oppressor's boot. The former had history on its side. The latter had the future on its side. The church had grown used to being comfortable in the seat of power. It was a neighbor with the rulers of the day. But as they looked around their community, they saw a choice in front of them. Take the easy road or take the hard road and fight. The church chose a fight, and today Korea boasts not only the world's largest single church, but every year sends out more missionaries than all of Europe and Canada combined. Love is the choice to fight for something. And frequently, love will be the hard option between two choices. Forget the idea of love somehow smiting you. There are no cherubic angels with bows and arrows around you. Love, whether you're talking about God or your family or your partner or your work, is always going to be something that requires you to fight for it. The choice to love is a choice to climb back into the ring no matter how much bigger your opponent is than you, because you know that the judge's card has already been written. You know that the fix is in. All you need to do is do what Paul urges Timothy to do and keep going. Round after round, get up when you're knocked down and keep listening to the voice of your coach in the corner saying, I've done this before. I've been where you are. I know what it is to be beaten. I know what it is to be down, but I got back up, and the same power that compelled me compels you now still. The great theologian N.T. Wright says this about Paul. Love and grief, love and suffering, love and pain, or perhaps even love and fighting are very close, especially in warm, living, passionate hearts. Paul shrank from neither. He wrote constantly of love, the divine love, the human love, the messianic love, but he constantly suffered the pain that went along with it. When the church picks the right fights, the world changes. Slavery is abolished in the British Empire because the church picked a fight. Healthcare becomes a human right in Canada because the church picked a fight. Civil rights are literally written into existence in the southern U.S. because the church picked a fight. Empires are undone throughout history because the church picked its fights. So, church, the challenge before us at the end of 2019 is perhaps the greatest challenge that we've ever faced. By 2030, 9,000 churches across this country are going to close their doors. Is there a fight left in us still today? Thanks be to God.